This is Householders' Options to Protect the Environment, Hope Incorporated Australia. We engage with citizens and communities to help achieve better, responsible environmental protection and stewardship locally, nationally and globally. We work from and adjacent to the traditional lands of the Gayabal, Jadawa and Yugara peoples of southeast Queensland, and we acknowledge our deep respect for the inspiring protective nature stewardship carried out by First Nations communities around the world for thousands of years.
Home is critical to everyone, and it's the most important resource if you're vulnerable and you're trying to become more well, you're trying to participate more, you want to take hold of those opportunities, but without a home it seems almost impossible. And even if it's a conversation in your playgroup, a conversation at your school, a conversation in your church, there are all sorts of things that people can do to move us all in a better direction. And I would return that power to the hands of people listening and to the people around you.
In this episode, we turn our attention to one of the most urgent and deeply human challenges facing Queensland and Australia in 2026, and that is the housing crisis. It's a crisis touching almost every community. Home ownership is slipping out of reach for younger generations. Rents have surged far beyond wages. Essential workers are being priced out of the very towns and cities they serve. And homelessness, including the hidden forms we rarely see, is rising at a pace unmatched in decades. As with many interconnected challenges explored across this series, today's housing crisis is driven by deeper system-level forces. In Queensland and across Australia, these include decades of underinvestment in social and affordable housing, population growth and demographic shifts outpacing supply, speculative investment treating housing as a wealth-building asset rather than a human right, climate-driven displacement and mounting insurance stress, and a fragmented planning system spread across multiple agencies without shared long-term goals. To make matters worse, these structural causes of unmet housing need, a profound social justice and human rights failure, are still too often glossed over by vested interests, eager to claim the crisis is too complex, too entrenched, or too costly to fix. But what if we refused those self-serving narratives? What if we applied the imaginative, future-focused lens used throughout this podcast series and flipped the script? What if we asked, quite simply, what if we could house everyone who needs a home in Queensland in the decades ahead? Thankfully, some visionary organisations, policy innovators and communities have been asking exactly that. One of the most important and long-standing leaders in this space is Q-SHELTER, Queensland's peak body for ending homelessness and unmet housing need. Since the late 1980s, Q-SHELTER has been a powerful advocate for system-level reform. Today, they are extending that leadership by doing something rare in Australian public policy, setting a bold, long-term, whole-of-system vision to help ensure every Queenslander has a home by 2045. Their latest strategic plan lays out a future-ready housing system, one that delivers good-quality, affordable homes for all who need them, adapts to climate disruption, and embeds community insight and lived experience at every level. In short, a housing system fit for the 21st century. And helping me unpack Q-SHELTER's role as an exemplar of visionary advocacy and what it will take to solve Queensland's housing crisis is my inspiring guest, Fiona Caniglia, CEO of Q-SHELTER. Fiona's background in social work and environmental advocacy has uniquely equipped her for this moment and for the leadership required to shape a fairer housing future. So, Fiona, thanks so much for you being here. I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
Same here, Andrew. It's a great opportunity.
Well, let's start that conversation by asking you to build a bit on my two-line, very short bio for yourself. Can you give us a bit more on your background, especially as it has shaped your work across your time with Q-SHELTER?
Look, I can't think of anything more universally important than a home. And everywhere in the world, people have homes that reflect locations, cultures, resources, and needs. Very, very early in my career as a social worker, people had serious presenting housing needs. And that included people with a great deal of vulnerability in their lives due to disability, mental health. Sometimes it was more circumstantial factors like the experience of domestic and family violence, or just being on really low working wages where it was difficult to afford a home, even all that time ago. So for me, centering on home as this universal underpinning resource that gives people so much of what they need in terms of a place to rest and recover, a place to look after themselves, a place to be with the people that they care about, a place to welcome people, a place to launch from for education, work, volunteering, participating, and just connecting. And for me, seeing that need present so early as a very, very young social worker just meant that I could in a sense, understand from almost the beginning of my career that home is critical to everyone, and it's the most important resource if you're vulnerable and you're trying to become more well, you're trying to participate more, you want to take hold of those opportunities, but without a home, it seems almost impossible. So that, in a sense, became my compass, and a very early compass at that. But it helped me to really be of a mindset that no matter who I was working with, whether it was one-on-one with a household or more structurally and systemically like I am now from the base of a peak body, that we need to understand what home needs to be for people, and then we need to do everything to make sure that pathway is there, whether that's through personal support or whether that's through more structural supports, investment and policy that favours the delivery of enough homes and all of the different types of homes that people need so that their needs are met.
Hey, thanks for that, Fiona. Very interesting. You pointing there to, going beyond bricks and mortar, the social, psychological and well-being elements of housing. It's not just, the physical infrastructure, it's all of those values. And I'm sure you're going to say some more about that as we go in here. But thank you very much for that background, where you've come from. And once again, thanks for the opportunity to interview you for the series. Okay, now, let's start to look ahead, because this episode and series is about future vision. You've already started to do this, but can you give our listeners now some early thoughts on how your work, going a little bit further forward, and of Q-SHELTER over the next couple of years, can contribute to getting us onto a better social, environmental and economically fairer development path for housing provision by 2040 and beyond? You've just been there talking about the bigger picture elements of housing beyond its bricks and mortar function. And perhaps you can put a particular focus on that brilliant visionary goal of your current organisational strategy, that is to have all authentic housing need met for every Queensland resident by 2045.
A starting point for thinking about our future state in a year like 2045 is a long way out. It's nearly 20 years away. Is to first reflect on the diversity of our own community. We are all different, and yet we share a universal need for a home where we can rest, recover and flourish. A home that's our base, where we launch to learn, work, volunteer, etc. It really is the start of everything. We know that home is also shaped by culture, location, opportunity, resource availability, and many other things. But to really start a conversation or continue a conversation about home, what it means and how we make sure there's a home for everyone, is to really reflect on that universal need for a home, and that in every culture, in every location, people have homes, and those homes reflect those cultures. It may be very different to how home looks in a place like Queensland, Australia, but still we have this fundamental thing in common, that we need a home as our base, and all cultures strive for that. And it's also important for us to think really deeply about all of the different trends and needs that are shaping the way homes unfold right now. There's simple demographic trends. We often think about the housing problem being caused by some external factor or player or stakeholder like the government or the private sector, or, there's not enough of something, and that's somebody else out there's responsibility. But in fact, our own population trends since the 1970s have been taking us towards smaller household sizes. And that means we need more homes of a smaller nature. Through COVID, with supply chain interruptions, for example, this accelerated somewhat, and we came through COVID only seeing the household size reduce very marginally from a statistical point of view, but it led to the immediate need for about 50,000 more homes, which is a staggering number of homes when the pipeline's been interrupted for the better part of 5 years. And at the same time, other trends that we're all kind of engaged with, so more people can telecommute at least some of the time, which might take the pressure off workplaces and the costs of fuel and other things like that, which is really positive. But it might also mean that they're working from home and their homes need to accommodate a working from home arrangement, for example. And I know that, there's debate among unions and other stakeholders about people having a safe home in which to work if they are working from home. So it raises a whole lot of other things about what that home needs to be like to accommodate working from home. And yet, we will always have a critical workforce that's needed face to face. So proximity to work and manageable commute times are all important to consider. And in that instance, location really matters. It matters less to some if you're working from home, but as much as ever to others, so that we can't just keep pushing people out from where their jobs are. I think the other thing to consider is that as generations come through, the need to consolidate in and near existing centres is important for social reasons and for environmental reasons. That continuous sprawl will impact the cost for households, and it will impact the environment, both in terms of usage of fuel and taking up greenfield sites to build those homes. So in addition to the things you said in the introduction, Andrew, there's a range of different trends and we're all part of it. We're all part of driving those trends, and we're all part of, facing the consequences of those trends, if that makes sense. So I kind of wanted to explore then, what would a vision look like if those are our challenges? There are many more challenges we could talk about. But if I think forward to 2045, I hope by then we have embedded excellent planning for the future. We will be regularly revisiting population-based planning to understand how much housing is needed. And to put this into context, we really didn't have population-based planning driving housing targets in Queensland. And while there might have been some social policy targets around housing, we didn't kind of really put them at the centre of policy, and we didn't tie performance indicators to them. And if we don't have targets based on population planning, we can't anticipate the needs of future populations. And there's a quote, and I can never quite remember the perfect quote, but in Walden by Henry David Thoreau's wonderful environmental text about his own journey with loving nature and thinking very hard about the form that home takes and how he wanted to live to be more gentle on the earth. There was a quote that said something like, "The people of the future will be thoroughly anticipated." And that's all we're really saying here at Q-SHELTER about future planning. We have to anticipate not just our needs right now today, but the needs of the future, not least because homes take time to deliver. Even if we get better at technology, they take time to deliver. So we can't just suddenly solve a housing crisis as we're proving right now. It's very, very difficult to do. From that planning, we will have embedded housing targets that will adjust to changes in real time. So we won't be waiting to review a regional plan in 10 years to understand our housing needs have changed. We will be doing real-time adjustments to those targets to make sure that we're on point and on target to meet the real needs rather than needs that were set at one point in time. If you look at just how things changed through COVID, for example, we need that real-time planning and we need to adjust and change in real time to meet people's needs. The other thing I envision is that our system will be designed to achieve prevention. Like, we're absolutely in the middle of crisis management now, but what does prevention look like when it comes to housing and homelessness? I think we will definitely prevent housing stress by trying to reach those housing targets. And I say definitely, this is my vision, right? We must be able to supply enough homes to meet those needs, so that there's enough housing supply as the most fundamental underpinning factor that will help us to avoid homelessness. But we'll be doing other things as well. That's on the supply side. As part of supply, we will make sure there is a mix of housing typologies. So everyone needs something different. And while that broader housing market has a very important role to play in boosting supply, we have to be very intentional about specific typologies that meet the needs of more vulnerable people. For example, we need social homes, which are at a percentage of people's incomes, and they are targeted to people who are extremely vulnerable on very low incomes. There's also something called affordable homes. Now, there's a wider meaning to affordability, but by affordable homes, it's our sector, the community housing providers, delivering homes that are available to people at discounted market rent in the locations that they need. This favours people who perhaps have slightly higher incomes through employment or through being on age pensions, for example, but they're still assisted into home access by making sure that the price point is right for them. They don't need those subsidised social homes, but affordable homes can really meet the need. And I want everyone to think about not having those homes. When we don't have them, it's the key workers, aged care workers, childcare workers, teachers, nurses, emergency service workers. If anyone's ever needed an ambulance in your life, you know what that's like. It's a devastating, terribly fearful time. But imagine if those people were not able to live anywhere near where they worked. Imagine if those people were carrying the stresses of not having a home that they can afford or that they can access. Imagine if we allowed those fault lines to open up. So there will be a well-supplied housing market through wider market measures, but we will drive ourselves really hard to achieve these typologies. I'd add to that something called supportive housing, which is where on-site support or very intensive outreaching support really helps to house people who are at the most vulnerable stages of life. It might be through mental health disability, it might be through complex and adverse childhoods and accumulated traumas, but those people really need us to rise to the challenge of building supportive homes, which are well supported through intensive support that is ongoing for duration of need. I'm pleased to say that the Queensland Government has signalled their support for supportive housing, and they're also building foyer housing for young people, which also comes with significant support. So in a well-supplied housing market, that will help to keep prices down, but these specific typologies will make sure no one else is left behind. Part of our vision is that mega events like the Games will not have caused displacement of people on low and middle incomes. The opportunities and positive legacy will be distributed across the community. There won't be winners and losers. It's a big part of our vision, and we're working really hard to influence the Games legacy to not just be about venues and the economy. These things are important, and they certainly help the community to flourish in a particular set of ways. But if we don't prevent displacement, then a whole lot of people will be living further and further away from where the infrastructure and the services are. So we really envision a future where the Games don't cost some people more than they can afford to experience or pay. I think part of the vision has got to be that as a community, as a whole community, we accept and embrace housing diversity and density, including those housing typologies I talked about. But as part of that, I think homes will be smaller, and some homes will also support multi-generational living, which is a trend we're starting to see. People retrofitting existing homes to have multiple generations stay in the same home or clusters of homes. I think that housing diversity goes beyond those typologies I talked about, and it's really about the form that homes will take, the footprint in terms of land content. All of these things will be a deep cultural change that we need to embrace. And I guess if we don't embrace that, then there will be people, coming through now into adulthood and perhaps in their young adulthood. I'm really deeply listening to what people under the age of 35 are saying about their housing futures. And if we don't think about the diversity of housing typologies and that homes will be smaller on a smaller footprint of land, then it's those people who'll pay the highest price, and they'll be shouldering the full responsibility for the economy and solving a whole range of other problems, making sure we have doctors, nurses, and all the things a society needs, but they will be struggling harder for this most fundamental thing. I guess, as part of that, we envision a need for a target of at least 20% social and affordable housing in the wider mix of housing. So we'll have targets and we'll be meeting those targets. And even if we're challenged to meet them, which we are at the moment, we're really struggling nationally and at a state level to achieve housing targets, even though they exist. We will be in a position to measure the extent to which we've met those targets, which is then the basis to start to adjust our strategy. What do we need to do differently? We'll have addressed regressive taxation measures that inflate house prices and rental costs, and housing will be considered essential infrastructure, and we'll be addressing things like the capital gains tax discount and negative gearing. And our national body, National Shelter, is definitely working on those two areas of policy, targeting the national government. Look, I'm going to say something now that is not often discussed, but we will have restructured the rental market if we want to have a really different landscape in 2045, so that there are more institutional investors limiting the impacts of individual ownership on tenants. So it's no way to build a society when going on, past 35% of Queenslanders are renting, and the majority of those are at the whim. They're renting at the whim of an individual owner who might need to sell. They might want to live in a smaller property themselves. But this instability of tenure means that we've got a certain and very large minority of our community who have no forward security of tenure, sometimes beyond 6 months. And so, we talk about the need for more institutional investors, as there are in other parts of the world where there's institutional investment, which means you can still invest in housing, but you're not the individual owner of a unit or a dwelling. And that means there are some safeguards to such short leases and just the insecurity of that form of tenure should the sentiment of the owners change. I think the other thing we will have done is arrested the decline in home ownership through shared equity, adequate supply, smaller homes, etc. And I really, I suppose, hope for that. And I know that both the state and federal government are really working on home ownership measures because of the resilience that this builds into people's lives. The financial resilience is incredible when you own equity in your home. You can realise that equity in bad times. It helps you perhaps get to retirement without housing debt and with security of tenure at a more vulnerable stage of life. There's no limits to what it can do, and home ownership is really important because the levels have been declining again since the 70s. And look, I think the other part of the vision, if we do all those things, we will be measuring the rate of homelessness as functional zero, which means we prevent homelessness as much as possible. It means that homelessness is rare, brief and non-recurring, and that's a really important way to measure homelessness. So we need to set a target to end homelessness, and we also need to then monitor the extent to which we're achieving that target, again, as a basis for adjusting our approach. I'll leave it there, Andrew.
Hey, Fiona, thanks for giving us that really comprehensive, really informative overview of some of the factors, past and present, that have been influencing and coming back to this idea of the central value, the social, psychological and well-being value of housing in creating a flourishing future society. You started to point also to some of the actual practical actions, tons of them, that could be taken now and into the near future and further future to ensure that we get to that better housing future. Houses that are affordable, secure, appropriate to need. So that flourishing future, which good housing is going to be one of the central bedrocks of, is where we're going now. As we fly into an imaginary 2040, I know it's not quite as far as your vision, your organisation's vision goes, but it's only 5 years short, so, and this is going to be an environmentally friendly flight because it's fueled with quantities of very low carbon future vision imagination. So this is our first imaginative exercise of the interview, Time Travel to 2040, and it is a thought experiment. But it's where we can step beyond the present business as usual world of roadblocks and pushback on credible visionary ideas. I mean, you've outlined a whole ton of them there, but we know, unfortunately, that there is going to be some pushback, well, there already is. But that ability to step outside of that for a while and describe credible, flourishing future development pathways leading us into the years ahead. And for the audience out there, if you haven't already listened to the Imagining 2040 series introduction episode, it might be worth checking that out now or after this episode, because it'll give you a better understanding of what we're sort of positioning as the two major contrasting views of the possible future pathways open to us in the years ahead. That is flourishing, obviously, is what we want to go to, and failing, which unfortunately is too often where we're headed on current trajectories. So Fiona, and of course all the listeners out there in podcast land, imagine you now have a device in your hand that can take you forward into the longer term future, take you to the year 2040, that is just under 15 years from now. The device might land you in one spot, or it might hover you over the future landscape. Either way, upon arrival in that imagined 2040, you sense immediately that this isn't a failing business as usual future, it's a flourishing one. And you know that because you can sense, see, hear, and even taste that it is a climate safer future world with, in the context of what we're talking about, well-housed citizens living in thriving communities alongside equally thriving green bioregions full of nature and wildlife. In fact, everywhere you go in this imaginary 2040 future, you can see a type of human development which is actually safeguarding, not damaging, the web of life. And in this future, the transition to treating housing as essential social infrastructure has contributed greatly toward an overall development approach which is actually helping to improve the physical and mental well-being of many more people and other species. Now imagine you've returned to 2026, ready to share a visionary time travel report with us, Fiona. So, can you give us a summary of your time travel report now from your imagined 2040 future? What really stood out and stayed with you?
I think it's such an important exercise to imagine what that could be like. So, imagining myself in 2040, I think the first thing I will notice is a more consolidated form of living where there are centres with infrastructure, with transport, and those existing opportunities that are so important to people like employment, education. But we will see people living in a more clustered way around these existing nodes or centres. And they'll be close to transport if they need it. They'll be living in environments that are extremely walkable. There will be people living in smaller dwellings because households are most likely going to be smaller, and those smaller dwellings will take many forms. They will have a smaller footprint. And I think I'll be really pleasantly surprised by the way that technology has helped us to build homes that are perhaps recognisable as homes, so they're familiar at the same time as they're different in that they use materials and methodologies of construction that accelerate building homes and get them happening more quickly and delivered more quickly to the people who need them, but also materials that help us to weather the kind of natural environment that we are in. It will improve environmental outcomes. It will reduce heat. It will give people beautiful environments to live in, but the simplicity and the resilience of the materials that we're using, as well as the methodologies to construct these homes, will have transformed our communities into something very recognisable, as I said, but also something that is deeply different because we've solved our problems by doing things in a different way. Behind that will be a construction workforce, I guess, that is more diverse, that will take these opportunities into factories. Those factories will be distributed as well so that we're building homes close to where they're needed. So if those are nodes and centres, regional towns as well will be flourishing. We will have stemmed the population exodus because we're really intentional about ways to strengthen those regional towns as centres as well and create opportunities for industry and other employment that brings people together again in an environment that is more consolidated, and that especially north where weather is such a challenge, the materials that we're building with are automatically making a difference to people's recovery from disasters and their preparation as well, because we've been able to achieve those construction methods and materials that really future-proof places like Townsville and Cairns. I think the other thing that will be interesting is just how communities are. So people won't be commuting as much if they don't have to, and that means they'll have more time in their communities. That might bring to life the public realm. If we're living in more intensified environments, then urban design becomes a really important thing, and these communities will be designed to bring people out of their homes, help them traverse common ground, common space, those spaces that we own together in the form of parks and walkways and pockets where you can sit, where you can be, where you can recreate. And that will help to redefine a new wave of community, a new wave of neighbourhood connectedness that will help people in reducing household sizes to not confront the loneliness and the social isolation, which we know is emerging. And we don't want it to have emerged in that sense by 2040. We want to have actually designed communities as well as homes to actually completely reverse that. So people will feel connected. They'll be living in communities that support them, where they are in reciprocal supportive relationships. They know people, they know names, they shop locally. There's a whole range of ways in which we bring back localism because people are gathered around these centres that is the place that they share and the place that they call home. I think that will have real meaning for older people, especially as household sizes start to really accelerate in their reduction in size, and having really intentional ways through urban design and through building design to bring people together will be especially important as more people will be older. I think it's interesting to think then about building design as holding in community spaces. If we're living in intensified, more dense environments, then is there a community room? Is there a room that you can use for a gathering? Is there a barbecue? Is there an outdoor space where you can sit and either socialise or just be there and enjoy yourself? I think we'll be designing much more for those spaces to be shared spaces rather than privately owned spaces. I think in terms of the psychological security of home, I hope that we have this measurable difference in the population's mental health and well-being, because people aren't worried about this fundamental resource. And I think we will also have a community that embraces housing density and diversity. The community is no longer opposing the development of new homes, and they are embracing the different types of homes like social, affordable, supportive housing. When we face mega events like the Olympic Games and the Paralympic Games in 2032, we will have come out on the other side of that, and its legacy will be felt in the way in which these communities are designed for people to move, to recreate, to socialise, and to retreat to their homes because they have homes, and those homes are adequate in the right locations at the right price points for everybody to be able to call somewhere home.
Fiona, thank you so much for that excellent the principle of holism. Everything is connected to everything else. That excellent holistic vision of a better housing future, but the whole raft of wonderful knock-on co-benefits, to use the terminology, flowing from that better housing provision, perhaps benefits that some listeners would not have appreciated before. But thank you so much for sharing your impressions of that 2040 you visited. And just to say, as in all the other episodes, this exercise is a way of showcasing a simple future vision imagination exercise, not used for entertainment or to create either a utopian or dystopian fantasy. Not that there's anything necessarily wrong with that, but rather, in this case, to demonstrate how straightforward it can be to start thinking about credible, flourishing futures, and also the uplift in people's spirits that can follow from that. And anybody listening to the episode, of course, can try out such an imaginative thought experiment and the others to follow. While the future vision of our various interview guests is imaginary, it is also anchored to their solid professional expertise. That's come across absolutely 1,000% from the discussion with yourself, Fiona, so far. It also comes from their lived experience in terms of, the values that you brought from your social work background and the human desire to achieve better development pathways which can safeguard the well-being of not only our own generation, but of the generations to follow. And we encourage our listeners to develop their own real-life connected future vision imaginations to help explore some of those intriguing what-if questions that we pepper throughout each episode. For instance, what if many more people could imagine and strongly visualize and call loudly for the achievement of better, flourishing future development pathways in and for their own communities? And also, in terms of this episode's focus, what if more of us could use Q-SHELTER's bold future housing vision to help us to start thinking differently about meeting future housing needs in our own neck of the woods? What if more of us in Queensland called more assertively on the powers that be to help make those visions a reality? Okay, now for a quick debrief, because time travel can be somewhat fatiguing. So let's do a quick check-in to confirm we're all safely back in 2026. So Fiona and the listeners out there, what month and year is this?
April 2026.
Great. So we're back safely in 2026. I hope you're not too fatigued, Fiona, because I have heard this from other guests that, they find it a bit disorienting, head spinning to go to the future and come back. But let's stay grounded in the present as we explore another way to imagine flourishing futures by noticing what's already here and emerging in the present moment. And I mean, look, you've already covered this in some respects in your opening comments here, but let's just continue here to talk about the idea that if we notice existing ideas, activities, events, or initiatives which can be considered as good examples or pointers toward or signals of better ways of doing development, if perhaps we refined those, multiplied those, or extended them, we could increase our chances to get onto the better development pathways we want to achieve. Such promising future signal opportunities can be found in, well, by the sounds of it, Fiona, in your strategies of your organisation. They can be found in reports of cutting-edge beneficial new technologies, progressive policy proposals, promising trends in well-being economy adoption, and in any genuinely fresh, genuinely bold, and I stress genuinely here, genuinely bold insights on how to do future development which could actually benefit the overall public good. Such signals of the future give us a glimpse of the kind of better world many of us would like to see in 10, 15 or 20 years and beyond. And these signals aren't fantasies from utopia. They're real initiatives happening right now, and they are pointing us toward the possibilities for better times ahead. So for you, Fiona, and our listeners out there, here's the second imaginative exercise question of the interview on signals of the future in 2026. So drawing on your professional work interest and networks at Q-SHELTER, or from your everyday life, what do you see as some of the most promising signals of the future in the way I've just defined them?
I do think that it's very exciting that the housing conversation is very much alive. I don't think we could have said that 10 years ago. I think it was still set and forget in our minds. And I guess it's because we are in the middle of something that seems, it doesn't just seem like a crisis, it is actually a crisis, so that we, need to it kind of reflect that we've come a long way in the level of community debate, which I really commend, and that's something we need to keep alive and keep going. We can't just afford to set and forget again. I think it's also true that generationally there is change about what people need and want as a home. People are adjusting their expectations and they're thinking in more diverse terms about what those homes need to be. And I think there is a deep concern about our future in terms of the environment, in terms of climate change. And so people, I think, will grow in their concern about how we go forward with a solid sense of what homes need to be like, but also what sustainable homes need to be like, as well as accessible homes for people with access and mobility issues. There's all sorts of different themes that I think we will hold in a deeper, better way than we have in the past.
Fiona, thank you for that. That future vision exercise and thought experiment demonstrates how identifying signals of the future could be used to help accelerate progress toward adopting better, more genuinely democratic, citizen-identified development initiatives, just to start thinking about what's good now in 2026 what's pointing in the right direction, and then perhaps to strengthen those initiatives, amplify them, multiply them. So, coming back to one of those mercurial what-if questions, in terms of this exercise, what if our listeners out there and other people started to actively spot their own progressive signals of the future, those pointers to better ways of doing future development? And what if those same citizens, in growing numbers and alliances, worked together to draw greater attention to those signals, as well as demand stronger political action from governments to support them?
Look, I think people working together on housing solutions is really important. And in fact, there are many community housing organisations out there right now that actually started with people sitting around a kitchen table and saying, we've got a problem. And this is back in the 80s. So the idea of community development as a method of people coming together, identifying their challenges and taking meaningful actions to solve those challenges makes all the sense in the world. We're actually thinking at Q-SHELTER about how to create and facilitate and support place-based movements of people that understand the housing challenge, are literate about the solutions, that strike up the conversations with their neighbours, with the people in their clubs, churches, schools, and also with elected representatives to be talking about the challenge, but most of all thinking about how the solutions can unfold in their own place. And if we think about any solution to any real challenge, it might require national policy and state policy, but at some point those solutions have to unfold in a particular place with a particular piece of earth under our feet. And so how local communities get involved at that point is really exciting to contemplate, both to ask for homes and expect them and advocate for them. And then as those homes are being delivered and developed, to be the voice of, I suppose, continued advocacy to help other people in the community understand why they're important. And then as people come to live in those homes, figure out how we will radically welcome them into their new homes and help them to become a part of the community that they are living in, help them to reach beyond the front door and get involved. And that will mean a whole myriad of different things. But, that's why at the bottom of everything we say at Q-SHELTER, I actually think the most vital role in solving this challenge is in the hands of the community, to become literate about the causes, the solutions, embrace those solutions, and then engage at every level, including at the elected level, to present solutions and most of all signal that you offer a mandate, an ongoing mandate for policy and investment in housing solutions. And I just think that is a radical conversation at every stage of housing, when it's just a thought in your mind right through to the day somebody moves in the front door. What can the community do? And there's so much the community can do.
I couldn't agree more. Lovely wrap up to that, follow-on point to what I was talking about there. And lovely to hear, nice to hear that localised community empowerment focus, citizen inclusive values, are obviously front and centre of your organisation. So great. I mean, this is democracy. It will be in the future. Democracy in action, true democracy, citizen inclusive, citizen led processes, planning process, thinking process. Fantastic. Okay, now as we near the end of today's great episode, Fiona, let's return to your inspiring vision centred around a much better level of housing provision and all of the fantastic flow-on effects that you described as a result of that. Resulting in a major reduction of unmet housing need in Queensland by 2040, and with your goal 5 years beyond that, as completely reducing it perhaps. But sadly, back here in 2026, such visionary and progressive ideas are still far too often being ignored or dismissed. I mean, you've got a challenge on your hands here, even though it's a brilliant vision. On the other hand, we hear stuff as, often claims being made that, well, trying to house everyone, yeah, it's a good idea, but look, it's too unaffordable. It's perhaps unrealistic in the context of the current economic situation, or whatever particular version of pushback might be being voiced. You'd know better than I would in terms of the specifics for your neck of the woods. But this particular challenge is generic across all sectors. That is the frequent pushback on credible visionary ideas which are being proposed to help achieve better development pathways. And we also cover that because I think it is such a crucial point. we cover that in the series introductory episode, where we outline how manufactured stories, disinformation and propaganda put out by vested interests can often distort and even hijack the opportunity for the sort of calm, balanced and progressive discussion that we've been having on the opportunities to achieve better futures. So we're having that credible discussion in this episode about achieving better housing futures, and we know they are possible and plausible, and we know they could be achieved in Queensland and in other parts of Australia. So I now just want to stay with this idea of vested interest pushback and how we can sort of defeat that or at least resist it. Let's stay a little longer with those imaginative possibilities, because this series is all about the use of imagination. And let's come to the last imaginative question and exercise of the interview as we round off this excellent discussion. And this exercise demonstrates the idea of taking unlimited assertive actions to achieve the very sort of flourishing futures we've been talking about in terms of housing need in this episode. But these actions in imagination cannot be resisted by vested interest pushback. So folks out there, perhaps don that sparkling, imaginative thinking cap one last time for this episode. And to you, Fiona, and our many capped audience out there, imagine you wake up tomorrow and discover you've gained a wonderful power shared with many other friends and allies to enact bold, well-considered collaborative reforms that will greatly benefit our human and more than human communities, that is, the natural world and other species. And further imagine that those reforms cannot be blocked by vested interests. What an uplifting thought. Well, hey. So in that splendid, thought-provoking scenario, what are up to 3 actions you'd take immediately to help steer and speed us toward becoming that better housed Queensland and Australia? Far away, Fiona.
Look, I think underpinning the conversation about, to some extent, the here and now is it's important when you talk about vested interests. Like, I think one of the most fundamentally alternative ideologies when it comes to something like housing is the idea that you can leave the market to supply what's needed, and that the market, if they have the right conditions, will do that, versus a more interventionist approach that requires structural reform to how we deliver housing, and in particular a deep commitment to social homes, affordable homes and supportive housing typologies. So our view is that if the market could deliver, it would have done that at other times in our history when we had post-war nation-building activities, building lots of homes. It was due to government intervention, and that met with the capacity of the private sector, of course, to assist. So the things I'm about to say are underpinned by a view that we can't afford a laissez-faire approach to the market delivering homes, because on its own, without intervention, we won't get the results that we need for the diversity of people in our community. I would say in the first instance, in terms of the now, it's critical that we embrace technology to build homes faster and in a decentralised way. And we need to transform the workforce and the supply chain in that process. And this creates enormous opportunities for environmental outcomes as well. And I can't, overstate enough the need for that. And that it isn't a sub-part of the industry that will just flourish on its own. It needs some interventions to help that industry step up and scale up to do that. As a here and now thing that I think is critical, particularly in Queensland, is to limit rent increases to inflation and only once a year. So our legislation only limits rent increases to once a year, but limiting rent increases to inflation just means that people aren't facing extremely high rent increases. We favour, the legislation as it is in the ACT. So, if we did that now, the trajectory for people would be really different to think about that future state. And if we set a target right now to end homelessness, we need to be ambitious, set that target of functional zero by the Olympic and Paralympic Games in 2032, then that creates, if you like, more of a pressure cooker in which we feel that pressure to reach for the stars and do really, really well, so that people are not only not displaced, but they are well housed and well supported.
Oh, thanks, Fiona, for that reflection. And love the fact that you've given a well considered but critical reflection on the so called wisdom of the market as it has failed. This is my view anyway, as it has failed better housing provision over decades in this country, not just this country. And of course, the same hollow wisdom of the market has failed so many other sectors as well. But that's fodder for other episodes, and we have been talking about that, the failure of neoliberal economics, in other episodes as they bear down on various significant problems that we're dealing with. Inspiring stuff, Fiona. As with other episodes across the series, it's so energising to hear Future Vision Imagination pointing us toward possible actions to achieve better, could do and can do futures, as opposed to hearing the long list of self-serving, wisdom of the market, business as usual reasons why we can't do future development in genuinely beneficial ways which support the public good. And now, coming to the end of this great interview, Fiona, one last question. That's the general wrap-up question. Do you have any parting words of wisdom for our audience? You've already given us a huge amount of words of wisdom, unlike the market. Perhaps a pithy comment which summarises your core messages, or perhaps a suggestion for how listeners could get involved with or support the work of Q-SHELTER, or any other ideas or initiatives we've been discussing today, whatever you want to say in closing.
Well, I think there's a very good chance that if people are listening to this podcast, they already care about these kinds of issues. And they're already looking at their communities with eyes wide open, looking for the signs that things are not well, looking for the signs of what to do to make that different. And so I would really encourage that kind of, interpreting all of these incredibly, significant trends, wider economics, macro economics, if you like. All of these things can feel like we can't affect them. So bring it home, to pardon the pun, bring it home, look around where you live, look around for the signs of things not being well and for the signs of what could make it better, and embrace the range of solutions needed for your place. I think of leadership as not so much positional power as doing whatever you can from wherever you are. And even if it's a conversation in your playgroup, a conversation at your school, a conversation in your church, there are all sorts of things that people can do to move us all in a better direction. And I would return that power to the hands of people listening and to the people around you.
An inspiring invitation to round off today's conversation, Fiona. You've shared thoughtful, stimulating and energising ideas about possible future development approaches to housing provision, which could put us well down the path to achieving good quality, affordable, secure housing for all who need it by 2040 and beyond, 2045 within your strategy document. But I think if we followed your and your organisation's plan for that future, we'll be well on the way by 2040. We've also been recognising the important contribution that achieving the human right of good housing for all would make to flourishing futures in terms of greater community connection and engagement. Futures in which the deeply interconnected health and well-being of all our communities, human and more than human, here in Queensland and Australia, become mutually reinforcing and exist in far better balance than they do today. So, Fiona, on behalf of the Imagining 2040 podcast series auspice organisation, that is Householders Options to Protect the Environment, that is Hope Incorporated Australia, a very big thank you for your thought-provoking comments today.
Thank you for the opportunity.
That was such an energising talk with Fiona Caniglia. It demonstrated for me that there are credible visionary solutions to all of the drivers of unmet housing need I mentioned at the beginning of the episode. And it was so uplifting to hear that Fiona and Q-SHELTER are out there working to help put those solutions in place. I was also struck by two further points. Firstly, I was reminded that secure and adequate housing is a fundamental human right, not primarily an investment opportunity. That is an ethical principle that many of us seem to have lost sight of in wealthy but increasingly unequal 21st century Australia. And secondly, and as in other recent episodes in the series, it was good to hear of the potential for stronger everyday citizen involvement and greater public voice to help tackle the urgent problem of unmet housing need. A much greater role for such citizen democratic contributions to development decision-making will continue to be needed if we are to achieve the sorts of flourishing social, environmental and economic futures many of us long to achieve by 2040 and beyond. So they are some of the main ideas I shall take from this episode. But what about you, our audience, our growing community of visionary thinkers out there? What will you take from today's imaginative conversation? Each of our episodes invites you to join this experiment in future vision imagination to help us try to answer imaginative questions like, what if a podcast like this could help spark the shift we need toward more climate-safe, socially supportive and economically fairer development pathways? Or what if more citizens harnessed their imaginations to map out preferable, credible futures and advocated politically to make them real? Only time will tell if we can answer such questions. Meanwhile, we hope this episode inspires your own imaginative conversations in homes, workplaces, communities and beyond. Perhaps you could ask yourself, how might our imaginative podcast exercises, time travel, signals of the future, and taking bold actions help me reflect and communicate my hopes for better futures? And what could a flourishing 2040 look like for me and those around me? And if you're enjoying the series, please share it, leave a review or tell others about it. We want to help build a growing, visionary community committed to achieving flourishing futures. We'd also love feedback from you. What in the series resonates with you or challenges you? Leave comments on the podcast platforms or send your thoughts via email, social media or voice message. Details in the show notes and on the Householders Options to Protect the Environment website. Suggestions for future guests, topics or show format improvements are also always welcome. We want this podcast to be a collaborative journey and your input could help shape what comes next. So, until next time, keep your future vision imaginations alive, keep wearing your flourishing futures hats, and keep sharing ideas about how, together, we can reimagine better development pathways toward flourishing 2040s and beyond. My name is Andrew Nicholson, host of Imagining 2040, and thanks so much for listening. Householders Options to Protect the Environment, Hope Incorporated Australia, providing podcasts, research and community educational outreach to help achieve our future vision of a society which is genuinely sustainable, climate safer, properly nature protected, more socially supportive and economically fair. For more details on our work, please visit our website at www.hopeaustralia.org.au.